So what I had in store today was to talk a little bit about, Joe Kaplan kind of went into the weeds a little bit about Azure AD. This one's a little bit higher level, but that's okay. We'll kind of cover a broad spectrum as opposed to picking one thing. So one question I have is, how many people have EMS or Azure AD Premium deployed in your organization today? One or two, three maybe? Okay. So pretty much everything in here costs money. I'll talk about that. If it doesn't, I'll call that out. But in general, Microsoft would like to get paid for most everything in here. So I guess the good news is, since most of you guys aren't using this, some of this should be new. If you've got questions or whatever, jump in. It's a small room, and I'm happy to make this interactive versus me just kind of standing up here talking for an hour. So my name's, kind of by way of introduction, my name is Brian Desmond. I am a principal in an organization called Ravenswood Technology Group based here in Chicago, actually, which is kind of fun. I don't actually get to do this and go home at night very often, usually on the road someplace. But what we do is, amongst other things, implement most everything that we're gonna talk about. So hopefully we can make this a little bit real world. And then on kind of the traditional on-premises side of things, I did the last couple editions of O'Reilly's AD book, and Joe, who's in the back corner, worked on that project as well. And contrary to what all the salespeople will tell you, people keep buying the book. So I guess on-premises isn't completely dead yet.
Are they mostly getting shipped to India now?
What's that? It all gets converted to dollars, so I don't get to.
If not, could you send some copies there?
Could I send some copies there? I actually once sent a copy to a guy that worked for me, and the address was like relative coordinates. It was like this building next to this building that had this color. And to my knowledge, it never actually got there, and I think the shipping cost more than the book, but happy to try. Contact info is up here as well. Feel free to reach out if you've got questions or anything afterwards. Always happy to chat. So before we kind of talk about the cloud stuff, what I wanted to hit on a little bit was also the on-premises piece, because if you don't have your house cards in order with what you have today and what you've probably had for decades, all that stuff, that mess, that just trickles, I guess, uphill as it might be to the cloud, and now you've got the same problem that you've been accruing technical debt with for years and years. It just goes off to all the new stuff in the cloud. So. There's a couple things there. Having all that be secure and having that be a good foundation is really, really important. The flip side is the last one. You also don't want to go say, oh, we just bought all this new stuff and now we're paying the vendor who makes all this cloud stuff some nice large sum of money, and we're not going to use it for 2 or 3 years because we're going to start this massive cleanup project. There's a balance that you've got to find somewhere in between where we need to get the basics in order. And then we need to start taking advantage of the investment we made, because otherwise that's just money down the drain. And at the same time, keep cleaning up where we need to. So one thing I like to talk about, and I know Darren kind of touched on some of this in the beginning, is AD being the source of identities, the source of truth for Azure AD, and certainly your Microsoft Cloud investment. If AD is not clean, it's not trustworthy, then by association and transitively, that those same identities in Azure AD are not going to be trustworthy either. So there's a couple things I like to call out about this. One of these is this concept of clean source. So if A controls B and B controls C, that means that if I can control A, I can also control C. So put that in the context of AD. If I can do something to system B, think of system B as something that can give me domain admin, then of course, since I own A, I also own B, I also own C, which is domain admin, and that'll trickle downhill or uphill, however you want to look at it, into global admin access in Azure AD as well. So if you look at the Microsoft documentation, they like to call this the concept of clean source. They also talk about the need for something called privileged access workstations or secure access workstations. If you're doing administration from the same laptop that you surf the web on, that you look at your email on, and so forth, there's a good chance that maybe something could happen or has happened to that machine, and that provides a potential adversary the path to escalate privileges. So the idea is with PAWS or privileged access workstations is that we do all that administration on this clean source, this clean machine that we've taken a whole bunch of work to make sure that it's as locked down as it can be and as unlikely as possible that someone can control that, someone can use that to escalate privileges. So that's one I call out. This isn't just about on-premises systems, but managing cloud properties, Office 365, Azure AD as well. All this applies there in much the same way. And then the second one I'll touch on a little bit, and I know Darren talked about some of this early this morning, is applying what Microsoft calls their tiered model, that concept to AD. And the big things here are, A, we want to isolate privileged credentials. We want to isolate the risk that someone can elevate or escalate across tiers. So in Microsoft's model for this, they have 3 tiers. They have tier 0. That's AD, that's ADFS, that's Azure AD Connect, that's PKI. Those are things that if I own this, I can own every single thing in the environment. Tier 1, that's all your apps, your member servers, your data. Everything that you think of as a server. For the most part, if it doesn't fall into that tier 0 bucket, it probably falls into tier 1. And then finally, client computers, so your PCs, your laptops, your phones, and so forth, fall into tier 2. The important thing here is to assume that from an assurance level, each of these tiers operates at a lower assurance level. So tier 2 operates at the lowest level of assurance. That's the PC that I'm using to browse the internet, that people are using to do their work. Tier 1 is where the data is. That operates at a lower level of assurance than tier 0, but it operates at a higher level of assurance than tier 2. And then finally, tier 0 is the highest level of assurance. So the last thing I ever want to do is have a situation where something that's really high assurance, a domain admin account is the really practical example, is on a lower level of assurance device. If I'm using a domain admin account on someone's PC to fix it, this is a really good way to get an entire environment owned in a really fast way. With these tiers, what we can do, we typically put group policies in. We put those into block movement so that people can't use a high assurance, a tier 0 credential to connect to a lower assurance tier. And it makes sure that people can't necessarily move laterally or escalate privileges. So this is just part of that putting controls in place to really lock down AD. Locking down AD, of course, makes it much harder to own things like Azure AD. That becomes another point where I can expand and have a lot of control. So that's my little, having a secure foundation is super important. The rest of this we'll talk about Azure AD in particular and some of the newer, shinier stuff. But before we do that, the thing with these projects, for these projects to be successful, for these investments to be successful, you've got to go into it and you've got to create momentum. Once you get going, once you have wins, you're going to have more of them. If you create one of those monolithic waterfall projects that goes on for years and years before you get any results, the end outcome is usually not all that great, and people also get really impatient, wondering when they're going to get value from this, from the investment they've made. So as we talk through this, we'll talk about setting some of these foundations, building those foundations so that we can iterate and keep delivering value quickly, as opposed to waiting until the end to actually deliver anything. So the first one I like to talk about is self-service password reset. This has, of course, been something that's been around for a really long time. And every time you get whatever analyst magazine you like to read, or maybe you read SkyMall on the way home from the last conference, they probably came up with some number that it costs $30, it costs $50 a password reset. Pick your number, they've all got one. The bottom line, though, is you can take that data and very quickly put together a business case for why a feature like this is going to actually add value and save money in your organization. Azure AD has a self-service password reset feature that's on the web, and it's also on the Control-Alt-Delete screen now. The bottom line is it provides a vehicle for people to solve this problem on their own. And then we'll talk about in a little bit, Joe touched on this a little bit, there's also ways when you detect that an account's compromised if you have this feature, to automatically reset passwords for people. The trick with this, you have to change behavior, and there's two things. One, everyone has to be forced to register for this. They have to provide some sort of detail to be able to identify themselves, of course, other than their password when they forget it. If people wait until they've forgotten their password, you have a chicken and the egg problem. They can't register because they don't know how to prove who they are. So getting through that campaign so that every single person is enrolled, and then as you onboard new people, new employees, they get onboarded as well, is critical for this to actually be successful. With the Azure AD Password Reset solution, you have security questions, which are not so good, but sometimes you have use cases where that's the only option. You have email to an alternate email address, like a personal email address, text message, voice call, and then relatively new, the ability to use the Microsoft Authenticator app to reset your password. And then the second part that's behavior, your help desk, your service desk, they can't keep being the person that everybody calls. Press 1, I forgot my password, and then there's that 30 or 50 bucks or whatever the number is to actually do that. People have to be trained to actually use this thing. It's available, you have to go out and use it. And then finally, the Azure MFA and then self-service password reset, they've actually converged those registration experiences. So it used to be I enrolled for self-service password reset, I gave them my phone number and so forth. Then we rolled out MFA, I gave them my phone number, I gave them I registered the Authenticator app on my phone. Why was I doing that twice? Those are now one registration. So as long as people are registered for one, they're registered for the other. And then also relatively recently, that Control-Alt-Delete experience that's on Windows 10, where I clicked the I forgot my password button on the logon screen, that's been brought down to Windows 7 and 8.1 as well. That's a good question. So do I need to do password hash sync to use self-service password reset? And the answer is no. The way this works, so this is a whole cloud-hosted experience. Of course, I need to reset my on-premises password. So there's a feature in Azure AD Connect called Password Writeback, where it establishes a channel with Azure AD, and anytime I change my password in self-service password reset, it pushes that password over the channel in real time. It evaluates that against my on-premises password complexity rules, and then it resets the password.
Question.
Yeah.
Is that the PCNS service?
The question was, is that the PCNS service? And PCNS is
Agent?
password change notification service. It's not. This is all native to Azure AD Connect. Question or?
Oh, you should always do password hash sync.
Yes, I have a slide on that.
Okay, yeah, then we can argue about it then. Perfect.
Yeah, we'll touch on that when we get there. So another one, and we do these projects sometimes, and they're these just monotonous factory projects where we onboard hundreds or thousands of apps to do single sign-on with Azure AD. So Azure AD can do SAML, it can do OpenID Connect, it can do OAuth, all the usual frequent flyer protocols out there. If you have tons of apps that have standalone credentials today, maybe some of them use Windows Integrated Auth, some of them use various silos, some are hooked to ADFS or Ping or whatever you use, you can move all those apps to Azure AD, and then you get that whole conditional access experience that Joe talked about. The trick with these is it's like a factory project. There's going to be so many apps, you have to run through every one, and they become a process of getting the right people involved, making the changes, moving on to the next one. Typically, we'll start with either apps that everyone uses. So if you have an HR portal, an intranet, a ServiceNow, something like that, getting those apps on first gets everybody using the service. The other ones sometimes we'll hit really early on are the apps that maybe only a dozen or 50 people use, but they're super high risk. Maybe they have financials in them, maybe they have sensitive IP in them. Getting those to a centralized service where we can apply controls adds a lot of value, even if it doesn't touch a whole lot of people. The other things with this is there will be apps as you go that either don't work today with Azure AD because they have specific requirements around SAML, they don't do single sign-on at all, whatever the reason is. Those just have to go to the back of the line, and you come back to them when you can. The actual single sign-on capabilities in Azure AD have evolved quite a bit. If you have ADFS today and you've made a large investment in it, there may be things that you're doing with ADFS that Azure AD either couldn't do or still can't do. There's a lot of work going on to make sure that that those scenarios get unblocked so that all those apps can actually move to Azure AD. But the big thing is that we can't just say, well, we're not going to move any of them because we've got this one over here that we've found a reason for. The other one is app vendors. They love to stand in their own way about this, even though doing this will probably add a whole bunch of inherent security to to how you access whatever that SaaS service is and so forth. For whatever reason, these vendors love to get in the way. So typically what we will see is either vendors that charge a fee to actually turn this on, vendors that will make you wait until they get around to it, vendors that will tell you, well, it only works with this platform. And as long as you tell them, yes, we're using that platform, and you kind of wink, nudge, nudge, magically it works even though you're not. And kind of the list goes on. So it's something to plan for, especially when we do this with smaller customers where budgets are a little bit smaller. Maybe you've got 20 apps and every single one of them, or half of them, charge $1,000, $5,000 an app. Suddenly that's that's money that wasn't budgeted for. So it's something unfortunately to plan for. And the last one is Fiddler. Everyone's used Fiddler, heard of Fiddler? About half. Fiddler is a free download. It shows you everything that happens as HTTP traffic goes between your browser and wherever you're going. It also stands in the middle and decrypts SSL traffic. That means you can see everything that, from a single sign-on perspective, that's happening, and you can probably troubleshoot a problem far faster than any app vendor will ever be able to do. So, like I said, it's a free download. It's something that you should have on your PC if you don't already. So another quick and easy one is something called PIM, or Privileged Identity Management, in Azure AD. And what this enables you to do is take all your built-in admin roles in Azure AD, as well as access to Azure resources, and turn that into just-in-time access. So today you have permanent access. I'm a global admin. For example, anytime I log in, I'm a global admin. With PIM, you mark everyone as what they call eligible. Now, nobody is a global admin, but I'm allowed to step up to global admin for a period of time that you define. Maybe it's 4 hours, maybe it's 8 hours. I come in here, I click activate. Now I have global admin access for a short period of time. I do my work. The system automatically takes me back down to being a normal user. Maybe there's really sensitive work that I need to do. Not only do I need to activate that and do MFA, but I need someone else to actually approve that access so that I can go and do that. The other fun thing with this, especially if you have creep where you have lots of people with privileged access, now you get a report of when the last time everyone activated their roles. Suddenly those people that say, yeah, I really need that to do my job, well, it turns out you haven't used that in 6 months. So it becomes really easy to make data-driven decisions about who needs to maintain access.
Question.
Yeah.
What's the recommended number of Azure global administrators that you guys recommend?
So the question is, how many global admins would you recommend?
Yeah.
That's a good it depends question. Less is more. Typically, we'll put a couple of break glass accounts in, so that's 2, and then large enterprises, like I often see, 3 to 6 is not an unrealistic number, but some of the RBAC capabilities in Azure AD and Office 365 are pretty non-existent, so there become use cases where that unfortunately has to be a bigger number, but less is more.
So there's not like a magic number or anything like that?
Yeah, is there a magic number? Yeah, there's no 42 global admins is the the answer to managing this. It's the same thing. The old question was, well, how many domain admins should I have? And well, how many do you need to run your organization?
Okay.
How do you set up PIM, or you have to have a set of users that are qualified to go and elevate themselves, or everybody can do that?
Yeah. So the question was, how do I set up PIM, and how do I actually say who's allowed to elevate? So the first time you do this, there's a PIM is a separate, separate area in the Azure portal. It's called Privileged Identity Management. The first time there's a button that says Set Up Now, you click it and something happens for a few minutes. You know, the wheel spins and then it's magically there. Everyone that had access still permanently has access. There's a role called Privileged Role Administrators, which are the people that can actually manage who can do what here. That's a really good example of a role where maybe it's not just I activate it and then I do MFA, but I also need approval from a second person to actually activate into that role. And essentially you'll go through and either mark people as eligible, which means they're allowed to step up and do just-in-time access, or people that have permanent access, it's always on, which is the status quo.
Is there a maximum number of global administrators that you can have?
Is there a maximum number of global admins? I don't know of one, and hopefully nobody is in a situation where they'll hit that number.
Make everybody an admin.
Sorry, I don't know of a specific number.
The reason why I'm asking is because we have a lot of different app owners that are, global admins, and we're trying to limit the access. So I just want to find out if there's a threshold, from a maximum, or should we just delegate the access?
Yeah, I mean, app owners should not need global admin to manage their app. You can mark someone as an owner of an app, and they can kind of do their thing with their app registration.
I like the idea of testing this though. Just keep giving more people, everybody who joins Azure, give them global admin and see what happens. Yeah. I think someone tried this experience in AD with domain admin before. I don't think there's a limit. It's still just as bad.
Yeah. All right, we'll let you know what we can.
It will tell you if you have less than 2.
Yes, you will get dinged on the secure score if you have less than 2. So if you're running your neighbor's accounting shop's IT down the street on the weekends, they need to, in addition to the one guy that works there, you need a second one, because if that guy gets run over by a bus or forgets his password, you don't want to lose access to the whole tenant.
And it has happened. It is a sad, sad day.
As just a follow-on to this, and following on to my conversation earlier today about attacking on-prem AD, it's not a matter of if, but when. All of those tools extend themselves to look at Azure AD based on access to on-prem AD. So think about that as you're thinking about how many global admins.
So I think that's a great point you brought up, right? So earlier in the day, we talked about securing your AD environment and how to prevent attacks, etc., how to make your environment more secure. As you go into Azure Cloud, whether it's PV, how secure is cloud?
How secure is the cloud?
Because how can you? So first, I like the answer, and I have a follow-up question to that.
Sure. I don't think I have an answer for how secure is the cloud. I think that's no different than how secure is my on-premises environment. And if you're making good decisions and you're running this to best practices, I think it can be extremely secure. And probably in some cases, because you're starting fresh, you have the opportunity for your cloud environment to be dramatically more secure than an on-premises estate that may have decades of investment or lack thereof, as the case may be.
So
It's not a case of how secure is the cloud. It's a case of how accessible is the cloud. So when somebody digs up the telecoms cables between your facility and the central switch, or some unfortunate hurricane takes down 10 miles of telephone poles to your remote location, then you're cloudless.
So let's say all my apps are in the cloud, and my users, they authenticate straight to cloud, nothing on-prem.
Yeah. So just
So in that scenario, right, you're eliminating the scenario of the cables and snipers and stuff.
Yeah, so in the scenario where apps are in the cloud and people authenticate to the cloud, I think it's based on practices and you know, you could put all your apps up there, but if the apps are poorly written, then it doesn't matter if the, you know, from an upstream security perspective, you've done everything you can if there's a, you know, a backdoor into the app.
I will say that a lot of the crazy exotic AD attack paths that we have to deal with don't really have cloud equivalents like credential theft, privilege escalation, all that stuff. That is a giant bag of legacy stuff that you don't actually get in the cloud. And there's an opportunity for it to be a lot simpler and a lot more well-defensed. The default permissions in Azure AD are much lower than they are in AD, and you don't have to worry about stuff not working if you try and type it out. So, I mean, there's a lot of opportunity for it to actually be much more secure. As with all things, you can also make a bunch of crazy bad decisions really easily as well too. But yeah, like your NTLM hash is being stolen, and then suddenly someone's DA 30 seconds later via Mimikatz. Those things are not really things you necessarily have to worry about to the same extent. And it's so yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity to have a much smaller, easier to manage attack surface.
Okay. Last thing I'll say on this one. So this is an Azure AD Premium P2 feature. As Joe alluded to, it's actually really expensive at any reasonable scale. The nice thing with this is you only have to license this for the admins. So if you have 10 global admins, or you have 100 people that have access between Azure roles and Azure AD, you only need 10 or 100 licenses of this. This is one of those things that you don't have to license the entire tenant for. Another one, so the app proxy is one of my favorite features that comes with Azure AD. What the app proxy lets you do is take traditional on-premises applications that do either Kerberos-based auth or, as of earlier this week, SAML-based auth, and publish those without opening any holes in the firewall, and make sure that before I get to that application, I've authenticated by Azure AD and I've passed through all my conditional access policies. And so the way this works, you have a set of connectors, 2 or more, however many you size it that you need. Those connectors make sets of outbound connections to a Microsoft data center. When someone needs to actually access an app that's published through the app proxy, they go to the same URL as they always did, except that URL now points to a Microsoft hosted endpoint. I authenticate, I pass through conditional access, then I'm proxied back through one of these outbound connections, and then proxied back to the application. So one of the key use cases for this, you can potentially eliminate the need for VPN clients or drastically reduce how often people need to connect to a traditional VPN. And not only are VPNs typically expensive, but people also just hate them. They're just one of those clunky things that no one likes to use. So being able to extend those same applications is really handy. When you extend that to, so if you use the Edge browser that Microsoft publishes on iOS, for example, it's actually smart enough, as long as you're signed in with your organizational account, to be able to translate URLs that would be internal but are defined in the app proxy. It's smart enough to translate those URLs on the fly and push them through the app proxy as well. So you get an email, you're in Outlook, it's to an internal site, you can tap on that, and without having to change the URL, it will actually push you back through the app proxy tunnel as well. In terms of behind the scenes, this is a lot of Kerberos delegation work if they're traditional internal web apps. So again, that's one of those things where some of the kind of, some would say, legacy on-premises AD knowledge is super helpful to be able to set this up really easily. The thing with conditional access, if I was going to wrap this up, this is the ability to enforce policy on all your apps in a way that you probably never could do before. And to be able to, those are quick wins to be able to say who can access certain applications, when they can access them, where and how. Before that was something that you probably couldn't do, or you couldn't do without a lot of complicated networking controls. Now that's something that you can potentially push policy down in a matter of minutes and get some of those results. All right, so this is always controversial. So there's a feature in Azure AD called password hash sync. How many people have that enabled or know what that is? Most of you don't have that enabled. So you should turn this on. It does a lot of interesting things. Doesn't mean that you have to give up your federation. The way this works, it never synchronizes plain text passwords, so that's kind of urban legend number one. You're never sending your plain text passwords to the cloud so someone couldn't get them and do something with them. You're also not sending the exact same password hashes that you use with your on-premises AD. In most cases, you're not sending them. What it does is it takes that password hash and it rehashes it, I believe about 1,000 times. Then it sends that hash of the hash to Azure AD. So even if I got that, the computational work it would take to back that out to a password hash that I could use with your on-premises AD is really big. What this buys you is a couple things. First, it buys you this thing called access to the leaked credentials report, which if you have Azure AD Premium P1, you have access to. And what that does is Microsoft actually, when these big dumps of passwords get put on the internet, through various channels, Microsoft acquires those. You can kind of figure out how they might do that. They take those giant data sets, they run all the username and password combinations, all the UPN and password combinations that they have in Azure AD against that list. And if they get a hit, they will tell you that they've got a hit. And that's someone that you need to have a password reset on right away. They show up in these risk events with users with leaked credentials. If you don't have password hash sync on, you have no way to take advantage of this feature. So it's something that I always tell people to turn on. It's essentially instant value and it has zero change from an end user perspective. The other thing you get is if whatever you're using for federation, whether that's ADFS, that's ping, you name it, has some sort of outage, you can flip to using password hash sync for authentication very, very quickly. If you wait until that outage to enable password hash sync, depending on how large your organization is, that can be hours to days to weeks before all those passwords are actually synced, which means that it's not really an effective DR option. Questions on that? Convince anyone to turn this on? Maybe? At least one.
Turn it on, it's a good feature.
The one thing that they don't tell you about this, that if you use Azure AD Domain Services, which is essentially the PaaS model for hosted Active Directory in Azure, when you turn that on, it flips a switch behind the scenes so that a whole bunch of different versions of password hashes also get synced, because you need things like NTLM and Kerberos to continue working. And previously, all those hash formats which AD stores weren't synced. When you turn that switch on, Azure AD Connect gets a little nudge next time it runs, and it will spool all those password hashes up. You can't use the Azure AD Domain Services feature without this turned on, so it simply is. But it's one of those things that I call out, because it's once that's turned on, it's not just I sync the hash of the hash. Along the same lines, there's another feature that came out relatively recently that's called Azure AD Password Protection. And we're all probably familiar with the traditional password policy in AD, where it's the 3 of the 4. It's the uppercase letters, the lowercase letters, numbers, and special characters. And as long as I have 3 of those in my password, then I'm good to go. Unfortunately, that creates a lot of really bad behavior, where every time someone's password expires, they do something like change the number on the end, or they go from an exclamation point on the end to an @ sign on the end, and then comes next, then a hash sign, and so forth over the course of 90, 180 days, whatever that window is. And the bad guys know this, and they take advantage of it. Like, the number of people whose password right now in your organization is winter 2019 is probably actually a pretty big number. So Microsoft has had for a long time in Azure AD, and if you use self-service password reset, not just the simple, do you meet the 3 of the 4, but they have this list of banned passwords that they know based on data they're collecting, people are frequently testing, are easy to compromise, and so forth. And if you use the self-service password reset function and you hit that list, it will tell you, you just used a password that we've seen before, you're gonna have to choose something else. That was great as long as you use self-service password reset, but if your password expired, you hit Control-Alt-Delete, you went to change password, it completely bypassed all that protection. So there's a capability now called Azure AD Password Protection. You install what's called a password filter and an agent on all your domain controllers. they dynamically get the latest list from Microsoft of what they think are the worst passwords. Now, not only is it your password needs to be 11 characters, it's got to have 3 of the 4, but it's got to pass through this gate as well. In addition to the passwords that Microsoft puts in that list, you can also put yours in there. So if you you work for Contoso, you might ban the word Contoso in your passwords because that's really easy to guess. Maybe you're in a building like this one that's on Randolph Street. You ban that word so people aren't choosing things that are potentially easy to guess based on your organization's profile. Yeah.
Sync the passwords from an upstream data source. So is there a way to leverage this with existing or once attached to AD?
Yeah, the question was, so we sync the passwords from an upstream data source, so if I have existing passwords, can I run them against this? And the answer is no. Do you have a question?
Is the password protection functionality for syncs on-prem, is that formally supported? Or my guys told me it's not formally supported by Microsoft yet.
Yeah, is the password protection formally supported by Microsoft? I believe this is out of preview, but I'm not positive on that.
So what was your question?
Whether or not the feature is still in public preview or if it's baked. Okay.
Random fun fact related to that, if you have another password filter already, it actually also works. You can use this in combination with an existing password filter, which is a really exotic use case I hope you never run into, but we did. So
Yeah, so the statement was if I have multiple password filters, they all work together, and that's true. It's a multi-valued list. It will hit all of them. So it also makes for confusing outcomes.
We use a password filter from another third party called Enfront.
Yep.
And our experience with that has been that when we use also SSPR, so we had to get the login password reset wrapped around the desktop login. What is it called? The DLL, whatever that is. But anyway, so that SSPR can, when you hit the forgot the password, can function to give you the questions to enter the forgotten, to reset your password. But then at the same time, this filter from Enfront will give you like a meter that will give you how strong is your password, what are the rules, like, if you have the company name and the password, or a series of 1, or the first letters, or the first character is a number, or it ends in a number. Things that Microsoft usually doesn't have in their group policy, a third-party password filter does have. But the experience is usually having to have some developer have to embed something in the DLL to make SSPR work with the actual workstation, Windows 7, Windows 10. So login. What is it called that DLL? I forgot the name.
Yeah, so I think so. The statement is if you have what's called a custom cred provider, which is if you want to change the little tiles on the control delete screen, some of the self-service password reset integration doesn't always work quite the way you would expect.
So do you have a question? Because so Azure SSPR is something that we've been also. You're talking about the reset from the login screen, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So curious, you guys are actually doing custom development on that, so it behaves differently when you click those buttons?
Yeah, so we actually had to hire somebody from the third-party filter vendor to modify the DLL to include this SPR wrapped around their credential manager, whatever you call it.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, we use a different password filter, right? It's different third-party password than the company you're talking about. You're talking about Enfront, you said?
Enfront, yeah.
Okay. But I think we are interested in doing customization on Azure SSPR page, if possible. So I may have some questions for you.
Okay. Cool. So once you're registered for the Azure MFA solution, there's another thing that's not really advertised all that well, but lets you extend that to on-premises apps. So namely things that speak radius. So that's typically VPNs, Citrix NetScalers, Citrix Farms, VDI solutions, those sorts of things. There is a plugin that Microsoft makes available that plugs into NPS, which is the radius service that's built into Windows. Once that plugin's installed, every single authentication that passes through it and succeeds doesn't actually return a I succeeded till it reaches out to Azure AD and does MFA for that user. So you can transparently point existing appliances that you have that do radius at this, and it will extend that MFA solution, not just to SaaS apps and things that are federated with Azure AD, but now to traditional applications that do that speak radius. So VPNs are the traditional example, but other things that you might have, you can easily plug this in. The extension itself, like it just works until it doesn't, and then you're a little stuck without a support call, unfortunately. But it does for the most part work really well and provide a really easy way to transition to the Azure MFA service. And if anyone's using the legacy MFA server, this kind of gives you an idea of the writing on the wall for where that product is going. So Joe talked a little bit about identity protection, which is kind of the branding name for risk-based conditional access. You get all that data from the machine learning tests that happen on every single sign-in. That starts getting exposed into what are called risk events in the sign-in data that you have access to. This is an Azure AD Premium P2 feature, so there's an added cost on top of the added cost for everything else for this. This is data that is super useful and allows you to make, kind of to the question about security in the cloud, make risk-based decisions. What I usually tell people to do, there's a button that turns on a 30-day trial. You get all this data once that's turned on. You might be really shocked with what you see, and it makes a really good self-selling business case often when you see the data that comes out of this. I've seen people turn this on and find out some percentage of their executives have accounts that have been popped, that sort of thing. You get this data, it's super useful. And then the last one I'll touch on. There are maybe 3 4 dozen apps in Azure AD that are not just set up for single sign-on, but they're also set up for outbound provisioning. And what this lets you do is now extend governance into those SaaS applications. So Salesforce and ServiceNow are two of those that I know are there, and they make good examples. But what this lets you do is take your on-premises AD security groups, map those to roles in these applications, and now as people pop into those groups, Azure AD will automatically connect to a Salesforce, a ServiceNow, whatever the app is, provision that user, and keep them up to date. When they switch roles by way of switching groups, it will update that in the SaaS application, and then when they drop out of those groups or their account gets disabled, maybe they leave the organization, they'll get disabled in that app. So you get governance there. You also get much better cost compliance for licenses because these people aren't being provisioned by hand. And then finally, if you have a custom app, anything that does skim, this can be pointed to, and it will happily provision to that as well.
So how does that work with, let's say you've got like a salesperson who their region changes or something, and that's typically something that you would handle in Salesforce. Say, okay, Mike Frost now covers these states, used to cover these states. So where does that fit in with, or how does this fit in with taking a user and giving them rights to different things or different regions? Or am I confusing this completely?
Yep. So I know enough about Salesforce to talk about it and not play a Salesforce person on TV, but to the extent that security is mapped by either an attribute or by AD groups, as those change, Azure AD will update those in Salesforce. To the extent that somehow someone goes in and clicks something and there's no way to map it down to data about the user, then that probably stays exactly the same.
So this would depend on your AD integrating with Salesforce and working out the rights to, I can run these reports, or I go on to this group that covers this region or something like that.
Yeah, so when you turn this on in the case of Salesforce, it brings all the roles that are defined in Salesforce in, and then it lets you map AD groups to Salesforce roles.
Okay.
So that's really what I had, but just to kind of summarize the topics that we talked about. So self-service password resets, often one of the easiest ones, and also one of the easiest ones to make a business case around. Privileged identity management, getting to just-in-time access, and also finding out who actually needs access to some of the privileged roles that they have. And then single sign-on to applications, whether those are SaaS applications or publishing those through the Azure App Proxy without requiring people to use VPN. And then wrapping that with conditional access. So not only do I have easy access to these apps, but I have the who, the what, the where, and the how as far as how they can access it. And then as far as their passwords, so we talked about please turn on password hash sync. It's actually, it's not as scary as it sounds, and you get that leaked credentials report. That is super valuable. And then tying that into Azure AD password protection so that it's not just about my password having some uppercase letters and some numbers and so forth, but it's not that winter 2019, which I guarantee you when their password expires in whenever it is, it's going to be spring 2019 ! Next. Azure AD password protection will catch that. And then taking MFA, taking that to your on-premises services, so it's not just about access to these SaaS applications, but things like VPNs and VDIs and so forth. You can do that with the NPS plugin. And then as you look at stepping up to the P2 capabilities in Azure AD, adding identity protection and risk-based conditional access, so you can make decisions based on that sign-in risk about whether or not someone needs to access this application because it's high risk. Maybe they need to do something like MFA or reset their password as part of that. And then also governance with outbound provisioning is kind of the beginning of some of the governance capabilities that are starting to evolve. So hopefully that was helpful. My contact info is there. Feel free to reach out if you've got any questions. I'm happy to chat. Otherwise, I hope this was helpful.
Thank you everyone for attending today. I think both Gil and I are really happy that you guys made the trek out here and lasted with us for the whole day. We're, as we talked about at the beginning, HIP conference is something that we're doing on a regular basis. We're going to do more of these one-days around the country, and then definitely keep track of us, and we'll probably be sending you emails, but when we do our big HIP conference at the later part of the year, we look forward to seeing everyone there. It'll be 2 days. If it's anything like the past one, it's 2 different tracks of speakers, so we have roughly 3 or 4 times as many speakers depending on how many people are there. And it covers a lot of similar topics, but also broader range topics with more variety. So I hope everyone can at least make it to one of those eventually, and I don't know if you want to say anything.
Yeah, I'd like to also say thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate it. I hope you got a feel for what the event is like. The idea is something that is congenial and collaborative, where people can talk to each other. It's not like the speakers are over here and the audience is over here and never the twain shall meet. This is definitely a community building event, and so you'll see a lot of the same feel and conversations that we had here today at the larger event in not New York, I guess.
Not New York.
Not New York, okay, so wherever it's going to be.
Plus a cocktail reception, which is never bad.
Yeah, you can't beat that. I'd like to say thank you very much to Ashley for putting this all together.
Yes,
I got the idea this morning was her hair was like out to here, but thanks for it. Even though this is in a Microsoft building, and Microsoft is very organized when it comes to this sort of thing, trying to pull this thing off is actually way more complicated than you would ever expect.
Yeah.
So thank you, Ashley, for getting that done.
I also want to thank Brian and Sean from Ravenswood Technology for helping us to get this spot. It was their cozy connections with Microsoft that made it happen, so we appreciate that.